Hello and welcome to an interview hosted by Durham University Hong Kong Society. So after the implementation of national security law, the pro-democracy took a huge hit. Some of the camp's candidates were barred from standing in upcoming legislative elections, while other activists found themselves on the wanted list of individuals who violated the national security law and are charged with participation in unauthorized assembly by the Hong Kong police. On the other hand, Chinese officials and individuals in Hong Kong were sanctioned by the US Treasury Department, as are condemned for undermining Hong Kong's autonomy, etc. Critics have called it the end of freedom in Hong Kong, the end of Hong Kong, and the end of one country, two systems. Mrs. Regina Suk-yee, a member of the Executive Council and the founder of the New People's Party, is here today with us to reflect what is happening right now and discuss what will happen next. So, Mrs. Ip, what are your views on the mass disqualifications of Democratic candidates?
That has nothing to do with the national security law. I think four candidates were already disqualified in 2016 for not taking their oath sincerely and seriously as required under the law. Recently, I think in connection with this year's legislative elections, which have been postponed, I think 12 candidates were disqualified under the Legislative Council ordinance, because the returning officer did not believe that they faithfully and seriously believe in upholding the basic law and pledging allegiance to the Hong Kong SAR. So that's not done under the new national security law.
Thank you. So how would you respond to the statement made by Joshua Wong on his Twitter account stating that disqualifying pro-democracy candidates would be a total disregard for the will of Hong Kongers, and doing so would trample on the city's last pillar of vanishing autonomy?
I think his remarks are totally unjustified and unfounded. He has no right to claim to represent the will of the people. At least 40% of Hong Kong people are opposed to the so-called Democrats. If you look at the polling outcomes, people like to describe Hong Kong's politics as being divided between two camps, as you know, the so-called pro-democracy and so-called pro-China camp. And even in last year's district council election, the pro-China camp got 43% of the votes. At least 43% of the public are opposed to the likes of Joshua Wong. People like Joshua Wong, Nathan Law are regarded by at least 40% of Hong Kong people as traitors who collude with foreign forces to harm Hong Kong. So he has no right to say that disqualification of the candidates under the Legislative Council ordinance is an affront is a breach of the rule of law or an affront to rights and freedoms. He only speaks for himself. He has no right to speak for us.
Thank you, Mrs. Ip. Speaking of Nathan Law and Joshua Wong, those activists, as mentioned in Mr. Ronnie Tong's interview with the BBC Hard Talk, he claimed that activists like Nathan Law had the freedom to go back to Hong Kong. But this is in stark contrast with him and several pro-democracy overseas activists on the wanted list for violating the national security law. How would you view the contrast, or would you say there have been some unclear areas under the new implementation of national security law?
Well, I don't think Nathan has been charged. I think he fled. He left Hong Kong on his own accord before any charges are laid against him. I'm not sure about the latest position, but of course he could be charged with colluding with external foreign and external forces under the new national security law. I think it is Article 27 or something like that, because I think it is collusion. Article 29 collusion with a foreign country or with external elements to endanger national security. Under this article, if you seek to impose sanctions on Hong Kong, you could commit an offense. It could be. It could fall foul of this article, but I'm not sure whether he has been charged yet.
So, thank you, Mr. Sip, for your reply. And we do understand that the current position may not necessarily be certain. However, a series of events occurred after the implementation of national security law in Hong Kong. For instance, France has stated that they would not ratify a 2017 extradition treaty with Hong Kong. And America has also stated that imported goods produced in Hong Kong may no longer be marked to indicate Hong Kong as their origin, but must be marked to indicate China. Would you say that Hong Kong has lost its privilege in being treated differently from China, from countries worldwide? And would this shift in status lead to a less competitive economy for Hong Kong?
I think the US, American politicians have been threatening sanctions on Hong Kong for some time. Last year, even before the commencement of the national security law, last year, because of the year-long anti-rendition law riots, some US politicians have been accusing our police of brutality and accusing China of undermining Hong Kong's autonomy. And actually, on November 27th last year, US Congress already passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which has some provisions for sanctions on Hong Kong, but with a sunset provision, valid for 5 years only, And this year, as soon as Beijing's National People's Congress indicated that it would introduce a national security law applicable in Hong Kong, American politicians immediately passed the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which President Trump signed into law on 14 July, in which include far more stringent sanctions on Hong Kong than the Human Rights and Democracy Act. In fact, the US is invoking IEEPA, International Economic Emergency Powers Act. It's also invoking its sort of National Emergency Act, treating the commencement of the national security law in Hong Kong as though it is posing a national security threat to the US. It's taking it very seriously, And I think countries like some European countries and the Five Eyes Security Alliance, I'm sure you know the Five Eyes Security Alliance of the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, I think they have been pressurized by US into, doing something, signifying their displeasure. But the US terminated the transfer of sentenced prisoners agreement. We have a set of 3 agreements with the US and over 20 countries in the law enforcement area. Rendition of fugitive offenders. We call it rendition, not extradition, because we are not a country. Transfer of sentenced prisoners, and mutual legal assistance in criminal matters. Now, the US terminated the transfer of prisoners and suspended the rendition of fugitive offenders, but they left untouched mutual legal assistance in criminal matters. But now China's MFA have said we would suspend it. Why did they leave untouched the mutual legal assistance in criminal matters agreement? Because that is the most important to the US. The mutual legal assistance in criminal matters has to do with things like Hong Kong assisting the US or UK in fighting money laundering, anti-money laundering. As a law student, I'm sure you know the G7 high importance to money laundering, terrorist financing, drug trafficking, alien smuggling. We have been helping them. Our banks, our police have been helping them. So that they did not want to lose our cooperation. But we decided to suspend it ourselves because I think the US and its allies are being very unfair to Hong Kong. All of them have highly comprehensive national security laws, far more stringent than ours. What rights have they got to dictate to us and judge the state of our autonomy? Whether we have a high level of autonomy is not for the US, UK, or their allies to judge. For example, as I wrote in my SCMP column published yesterday, in the 2019 Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, there are provisions which says that the US wants Hong Kong to hold free and fair elections, free and open elections for electing the chief executive, and to have universal suffrage-based elections for the whole of LegCo in 2020. We are now August 2020. The pace of our democratization is for us to decide. These countries are bullying Hong Kong. They are being extremely unfair to us. So I don't think we need to worry too much.
So regarding the national security law, would you say the failure of implementing this law in Hong Kong Basic Law Article 23 has caused or has significantly contributed to the current society's rift?
I agree with you entirely. I think Beijing had to take things into their hands and enact the national security law for Hong Kong because we failed to do our duty after 23 years, you know. Article 23 of the Basic Law says the Hong Kong SAR shall, on its own, enact laws to prohibit 7 national security offenses: treason, secession, subversion, sedition, theft of state secrets, prohibiting foreign political organizations from holding political activities in Hong Kong, and prohibiting local political organizations from having ties with foreign political organizations, you know. And national security offenses like treason, subversion, sedition, they're already on the statute books of all the countries of the British Commonwealth. Treason is already on our statute book. You know, we already have it under Crimes Ordinance. Section 1 is the first foremost offense under our Crimes Ordinance. Sedition already there, you know. Theft of state secrets already there, and prohibiting activities of foreign political organizations. Some of those are prohibited under our society's ordinance, so it's nothing new. But because we fail to fulfill our constitutional obligation under Article 23, and the Hong Kong government, lacking sufficient powers, have not been able to bring to a stop the year-long riots, anti-government riots, I think Beijing had no choice but to enact national security laws on our behalf.
So regarding the Hong Kong government, under the current social unrest, should any government officials be held accountable and make a step to resign from the administration of Chief Executive Carrie Lam?
I think the one practical question is, who will step into their shoes? It's not easy to find replacement. You know. This sort of accountability, stepping down when things has gone wrong, is easier said than done. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but from a practical point of view, it's hard for the chief executive to find replacement, suitable replacement in such difficult times. Moreover, ultimately, the chief executive is responsible for her choices and her decisions, you know, and she will have to take responsibility for whatever happened in Hong Kong in the past few years. So I think we need not worry too much about individual officers stepping down.
Apart from the external events happened to Hong Kong, as we have discussed before, Mrs. Ip, in Hong Kong, you know, Mr. Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong pro-democracy media tycoon and the founder of news outlet Next Digital and Apple Daily, was taken into custody for violating the national security law. Would this imply an infringement of one of our universal values, which is the freedom of press?
I think his arrest has nothing to do with freedom of the press. The next media is still functioning. The next media shares have skyrocketed, you know. Our free markets continue to work, although there are people who suspect there has been some, rigging, a manipulation of the stock market, but I won't comment on that, I think Mr. Lai has been arrested and released on bail for suspected offenses under Article 29 of the National Security Law, again collusion with a foreign country or with external elements to endanger national security. But he has not yet been charged, and in accordance with the rule of law, he has been released on bail, and the next organization is challenging the police warrants. So everything is still taking place in accordance with due process.
What about on that day when the Hong Kong police forces conducted search at Apple Daily offices? They have only selected a few of the news media to conduct interviews during that process. Their criteria is to select news agencies with considerable scale and had not previously troubled the police forces. Would you classify this as political censorship, which is to suppress the freedom of press in Hong Kong?
Well, you see, there are no lack of people in Hong Kong who think that the government should have exercised much better management of the media during government press conferences. You may have seen some highly disorderly scenes and extremely rude questions fired at government officials. If you go into police headquarters, of course you need to abide by rules set by the police. It's the same with the White House. President Trump has driven away reporters who raised rude questions. He has banned certain reporters from White House. Only those who are considered responsible ones are allowed to join US presidents on Air Force One trips. The same rules apply everywhere.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Ip. But speaking of the freedom of press and the national security law, how can Hong Kong balance the fine line of having freedom of press on the one hand while upholding the principle of national security?
Well, I think we have always proceeded in accordance with the ICCPR. As a law student, I'm sure you know the International Covenant of Civil Political Rights, which is enshrined in Basic Law, Article 39. And the famous Article 19 has to do with freedom of expression. And as you know, the freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press, is not absolute. It could be restricted in accordance with the law under certain conditions, including national security, ordre public, public safety, and all that. So I think we have always enacted laws with this in mind. If our law has gone beyond what is reasonably necessary, our courts have a well-established proportionality test. I'm sure you know. Well-established in many court cases, including the CFA judgment or Joshua Wong's occupation of storming of Civic Square back in 2014, and in Town Planning Board versus Hasten Development, many such cases. If the national security law is judged to have gone beyond what is reasonably necessary, and legitimately connected to a lawful purpose, the court will strike it down. So I think there ought to be a balance. And you see the national security law, of course, because it is new, there is uncertainty about how it is to be applied and how the courts would interpret the law. It will take time. It will take time. But I trust our courts. I trust our judges.
So there has been a Chinese saying, 治標不治本, which essentially criticizes an action for curing the symptoms of the problem rather than the actual problem. So do you think if the national security law is susceptible to this criticism?
Well, it depends on how you see the purpose of the law. the purpose of the national security law is to prohibit certain serious criminal offenses, you know. And it has been quite successful so far in producing quite a strong deterrent effect. You know, since the news had broken about Beijing enacting this new law, Hong Kong, much greater order and stability has been restored in Hong Kong. I can tell you, I have spoken to restaurant staff, hotel staff, who told me that they are relieved that Hong Kong has become more stable, more orderly since the enactment of this law. So from the point of view of bringing back order, discouraging acts which endanger national security, I think this law has been effective. But if you're talking about other problems, other social ills, other economic problems, other frustration on the part of the young people, that's a totally separate matter. Or simply about government winning popular support, government winning hearts and minds, that's a totally different matter. You cannot do that by dint of sheer force.
So as we all know, there's a lot happening now in Hong Kong. So what concrete plans do you have to reinvent Hong Kong for a brighter future?
I think the government really needs to implement deep-rooted reform, root and branch reform across a wide range of areas, you know. Land and housing, you know, not just slow economic growth, you know. Our economy is badly hit, firstly by the riots last year and now by COVID. But the COVID-induced economic hardship is global. It's not just Hong Kong, you know. Hopefully, we will climb out of the downturn in line with mainland China. China was first in the COVID crisis, but also the first out. We hope to follow mainland China's footsteps. But we need to address not just low growth, economic stagnation, but also economic inequality. I think economic inequality is a big problem in Hong Kong. We have one of the highest Gini coefficients among developed economies. And we are producing far more university graduates than our economy is able to produce satisfying jobs for them. So a lot has to be done. But I think politically, if I may say so, I think we need to help our young people come to terms with the fact that we are part of China. If you want democratic development for the sake of improving accountability, transparency, better governance, no problem. But if you want democratic development for the purpose of regime change, which some of my democratic colleagues have in mind, then it is bound to fail because we are part of China. You know? If you want no government would allow that sort of development. If I could recite to you something from President Trump, let me take it out. Give me a few minutes. Presidential order. Oh, carry on. I will try and take it. Oh yes, this is a recent presidential order, executive order by President Trump, signed 26 June this year. The purpose is to protect American monuments, memorials, and statues, and combating recent criminal violence. He was talking about people, trying to vandalize statues of Abraham Lincoln, these people, Sir Cecil Rhodes, Section 1 purpose. The first duty of government is to ensure domestic tranquility and defend the life, property, and rights of the citizens. Many of the rioters, arsonists, and left-wing extremists who have carried out and supported these acts, that is, vandalizing the statues, have explicitly identified themselves with ideologies such as Marxism that call for the destruction of the United States system of government. Cannot be allowed. This is what the Americans are saying. If you want to change our system of government, cannot be allowed. That's our position as well. That's subversion.
Sorry, Mr. Please go ahead. Sorry.
If you there's a difference between a political protest and a civic protest. If you protest against housing policy, Lantau tomorrow, subdivided cubicles, that's a civic social protest. But if you want to change the system of government through violence, through attacking, vandalizing, taking over the electrical building, throwing petrol bombs at the police, that's subversion. That cannot be allowed by any government. And that's bad for your future too.
Mr. Sip, so when comparing to Donald Trump's strategies in U.S., would you say Donald Trump is actually implementing a double standard criteria when comparing to U.S. and Hong Kong?
Definitely, and it's not just Donald Trump. American politicians have been doing that for decades. There's a book about it by Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University about American exceptionalism. America being the superpower always thinks it's God's gift to mankind. It's above everybody else. It always wants to impose its rules on others. And it's not just the US, the UK, his Five Eyes allies, they all have double standards. Why did the UK condemn us for postponing elections? Back in March, they already passed the Coronavirus Act to postpone all elections, including by-election, for 1 year. What right has New Zealand to condemn us? Its Prime Minister just announced postponing its election by 4 weeks, maybe longer if necessary, So there's too much hypocrisy and double standards in all these Western countries. Frankly, I'm quite fed up.
But but what makes them to do that? Is it because they try to attack through Hong Kong to attack China, or do they have any other purposes behind? Would you say, Mr. Sip?
It's partly ideological, because they think that their democratic system is superior to China's authoritarian system. And they the US in particular wants to democratize the whole world, as we all know. My thesis supervisor, Professor Larry Diamond, he's funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. His project at Stanford is, can the whole world become democratic? The Americans always want to impose their rules on others. But as we look around the world, a lot of the newly formed democracies have not been successful. The democratic system is not universally successful. That you need to have certain preconditions. So I think it's partly ideological and partly because US feel threatened by the rise of China and is using Hong Kong as a club to beat China. Unfortunately, we are caught in this geopolitical struggle. So there will be some more turbulence for us, I think, in the next couple of years. As for US sanctions, so far they have not inflicted too much harm on Hong Kong. As you know, they Friday, I think it was about 10 days ago, I think 7th August, it was 7th August, they announced sanctions on 7 Hong Kong officials, 4 Beijing officials, more Hong Kong officials than Beijing officials in connection with Xinjiang. Isn't that quite ridiculous? And what has China done? China has slapped sanctions on 11 American politicians and civic leaders, civic organization leaders. But again, those sanctions have more form than substance. They won't harm them because they are not going to visit China. They have no assets in China. There will be, so far it's just quick tit for tat. No real harm done. But the U.S. unilateral change of rules of origin is against the rules of WTO, the World Trade Organization, because the WTO has a technical committee on rules of origin, and all members of the WTO agree to abide by the rules of origin. Because I worked on trade for many years, I can tell you, for example, What are the rules of origin for a watch? A watch. There can be two ways of defining the rules of origin. Either the movement, if the movement is made in Switzerland, you can call it Swiss made. Or by assembly, if the watch is assembled in mainland China, you can call it Chinese made. So these are objective rules, and there are local content requirements. You can't say something is made in Hong Kong unless it satisfies the local content requirement. Our products satisfy those requirements, as my colleague Felix Chung has said, by unilaterally changing the rules of origin applying to Hong Kong exports. It's hurting us. And it could mean that Hong Kong exports would be subject to the same custom duty as mainland Chinese products, even though Hong Kong export far less to US than US to us. US trade surplus with Hong Kong last year was something like 26 billion US. In the past 10 years, the US has earned something like 300 billion US trade surplus with Hong Kong. So it's totally unreasonable. A giant like Hong Kong bashing a giant US giant bashing little Hong Kong is most unfair.
Mrs. Yu, as I've read your recent articles on why Hong Kong does not need more democracy right now, as published in South China Morning Post, you did mention one point that the government's declining efficacy support a halt in the expansion of democracy. Notwithstanding the limits of being a LegCo member or even an ExCo member, would you consider to run another chief executive election in 2022 to reflect your supporters' voices to the general public?
I am already, reflecting the voices of my supporters, to chief executive. This is a question that I cannot answer at this stage, but I can tell you why the efficacy of the government has declined. Because what are we? We are not a full-fledged democracy like UK parliamentary democracy. You have a majority ruling party, who can always muster enough votes to pass the Coronavirus Act very quickly. We have a semi-democratic system. The executive branch has no cast iron votes in LegCo. The governor of Hong Kong was the president of LegCo until 1993. The colonial administration always had a majority. When C.H. Tung, my boss, took over, he found he has no votes in LegCo. So it's been very difficult. You see, it's not just the pandemics who oppose the chief executive. We have said no to her on 三隧分流. You remember that? Rationalization of tunnel tolls. We strongly criticize her for cutting back welfare benefits for the elderly. We are very reluctant to support her Lantau Tomorrow infrastructure projects. So, because we also need to be accountable to our voters, our constituents. So it's been very difficult for the government. And there has been so much filibustering in our legislature. The German Consul General and the Japanese Consul General told me filibuster is not allowed in German or Japanese parliament. So it's been very difficult for the government. I think any sensible person, including myself, will have to think very carefully before putting yourself forward for the chief executive post.
What about for now, during the tough times for Hong Kong and Hong Kongers? What words of wisdom would you like to impart to Hong Kongers?
I think we are, of course, going through a difficult patch. Priority number one must be to get COVID under control. And we have many capacity constraints, like testing. The overall Hong Kong government has done a pretty good job, I think, notwithstanding our very dense population. But initially the government's testing capacity was only 2,000 a day. Hospital authority and health department laboratories. Then they roped in private hospitals, private labs, and now government has roped in some mainland tech companies, and now getting more help from mainland, and not enough hospital beds and all that. We are getting help from the mainland. So priority number one must get COVID under control so that we can reopen the economy partially. You may have noticed the local media's reporting that there could be some relaxation of dine-in hours for restaurants. As ex-school members, we are always the last to know. We always learn from the media, but as has been reported, the Executive Council is meeting tomorrow, cutting short our so-called holiday. So I think judging from press reports, the dining hours could be extended. Good news, because the restaurants are really, when you have no restaurants, no evening business, all the shopping malls, all the streets are dead. So I think we could get out of COVID just like mainland China so that our economy could recover. That's in the near term. And the second priority is really to help the economy. And again, it's the media reporting that the government would allocate another 10 billion for relief of the economic sectors, hard-hit economic sectors. So our finance committee would be meeting again soon, I think, So these are our priorities. Longer term, we need to address all the problems we discussed. Land and housing problem, it's really disgraceful that we have, tens of thousands of people living in very abject subdivided cubicles. A very long waiting list for public housing. A lot of graduates not able to find satisfying jobs. The starting salaries have stagnated because we are producing more graduates than jobs for middle class. That's the problem. So we need to restructure our economy. These are some of the longer term challenges. Of course, we can also move forward in democratic development to give the government stronger mandates, but only if people are not talking about democratic government to, overthrow democratic development, to overthrow the existing system of government, or to undermine China.
I hope
that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Ip. I hope Mrs. Ip's view will help our students to know more about her views on the recent social unrest. I think this interview has come to an end. On behalf of Durham University Hong Kong Society, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Mrs. Ip. Thank you for taking out the time out of your busy schedule to answer our questions on Hong Kong's political climate and help to set up a cornerstone for our students to enrich their knowledge. I wish the best of luck for you and your future endeavors. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful. Hope to see more of you in the future. And all the best.